The UFC just simply doesn't play around when it comes to hosting events at Madison Square Garden in New York City. This card is already making history by featuring two champion versus champion matchups, Islam Makhachev versus Jack Della Maddalena for the welterweight title, and Valentina Shevchenko versus Zhang Weili for the flyweight title. And if that's not enough, how about three potential number one contender fights, with two of them being in the very same division, 170 pounds, with the title being defended on the very same night? That's right, we've got to talk about Carlos Prates versus Leon Edwards, we've got to talk about Sean Brady versus Michael Morales, we've got to talk about Erin Blanchfield and Tracy Cortez, not to mention we've got Beneil Dariush taking on Benoit Saint Denis to kick off the main card, Bo Nickel returning from his first ever professional loss, Kopylov versus RoboCop, that one's going to be violent. Two undefeated 10-0 prospects, Malcolm Wellmaker and Bysinger Sursurkayev, not to mention Angela Hill is attempting to hold her top 15 spot against rising prospect in the strawweight division, Fatima Klein. This card from top to bottom is absolutely unreal and may just be the fight card of the year. So let's not waste any more time. Let's talk about the two number one contender type matchups in the welterweight division. And first we go to Sean Brady versus Michael Morales. When Sean Brady made his UFC debut in October of 2019 against a battle-tested longtime veteran in Court McGee, we immediately knew that we had a prospect on our hands at 170 pounds. And he proved that point to be very accurate, as he would start his UFC tenure 5-0 that also featured other wins over Jake Matthews and Michael Chiesa, and that would set him up for a big matchup against Belal Muhammad in October of 2022. And on that night, not only would we see Sean Brady face the most adversity of his career, but we would see him taste defeat for the first time in the UFC and in his entire professional mixed martial arts career in general. Not to mention, it was the first time that we had seen Sean Brady struggle to utilize his insane pace, pressure, and wrestling to solidify himself as a victor, as he would actually go 0 for 5 on takedown attempts against Belal Muhammad, and on the feet, he would be outstruck by a very wide margin, in fact leading to a second round TKO victory for Belal. And that was very telling at the time because Belal Muhammad was in the midst of his big-time win streak / unbeaten streak. However, he hadn't knocked an opponent out since September of 2016. So there was a lot of chatter at that point that maybe Sean Brady had reached his ceiling, and that if he's going to go in there and get knocked out on the feet by a fellow grappler, maybe there weren't more heights to climb for him. But after over a year away, he would return in December of 2023 in a big way by getting a victory over the longtime veteran, the former Ultimate Fighter winner, and interim title challenger, Kelvin Gastelum. And not only would Sean Brady dominate that fight for 11 minutes and 43 seconds, but he would finish it off with a Kimura submission, and he was back. Then he would follow that up with his first UFC main event opportunity, where he would go 25 minutes against former title challenger Gilbert Burns, and he would absolutely have his way in that fight, landing 7 takedowns, racking up 10.5 minutes of control time, and outstriking Gilbert 274 to 76. So now not only did Sean Brady prove that he could bounce back from a loss, something that he had never had to do in his past, but he was able to beat and dominate back-to-back opponents and big-name opponents at that. And that is what would set him up for the biggest opportunity of his career to date, and that was a main event in enemy territory, London, England, against the former champion Leon Rocky Edwards. And copy and paste what he did against Gilbert Burns here against Leon and times it by 20. Sean Brady would take the former champion down at will, landing 5 out of 7 takedowns, racking up 11 minutes of control time, and once again outstriking Leon in very similar fashion to how he outstruck Gilbert, with the numbers tallying 221 to 23. But this time it wouldn't be a decision for Sean Brady, but it would be a submission via guillotine choke in the 4th round. And now it was back-to-back dominant, ultra impressive performances, proving that he can go into the championship rounds and not get tired one bit. And against Edwards, he would put a stamp on it and solidify himself as a legitimate title contender in this welterweight division. But being that this welterweight division has 18 number one contenders, and the one getting the opportunity on this very same fight card isn't even a damn welterweight, but it's a lightweight in Islam Makhachev, Sean Brady has to fight at least one more time. Insert the undefeated Michael Morales out of Ecuador. At just 26 years of age, Morales is already 18-0 as a professional and has finished 14 of those 18 with 13 knockouts and 1 submission. And after earning his contract on the 2021 season of Dana White Contender Series, has gone 6-0 in the UFC, with 4 of the 6 coming by way of knockout. And it's the most recent 2 from Morales that would allow himself to enter the top 10 of this 170-pound weight class. First, it was against Neil Magny in August of last year, where he would finish him in the very first round. And then in his first UFC main event opportunity, he would take on Gilbert Burns, and in similar fashion to Sean Brady, he would dominate the former title challenger. But maybe you could argue that he did it in more impressive fashion because he put away Gilbert Burns by knockout in the very first round. And now Morales will get the opportunity to break into the welterweight top 5 for the first time in his career, and depending on how he gets the victory, if he gets the victory, he may just be able to solidify himself as the #1 contender for the winner of Makhachev versus Della Maddalena. And I think it's fair to say that this is one of those classic grappler versus striker matchups, because Sean Brady averages 3.62 takedowns per 15 minutes with a 54% accuracy. However, Michael Morales enters with an 89% takedown defense. And so if that 89% takedown defense comes into play here and he can keep this fight standing, very similarly to how Belal did it back in 2022, things all of a sudden get very interesting, because on the feet, Michael Morales is electric. He is lethal, he is precise, and he is the perfect mixture of technical as well, landing 5.62 significant strikes per minute, and will have a whopping 7-inch reach advantage, thus giving him the opportunity to keep this fight at his own range and at distance on the feet if he can keep it there, which could be cause for concern for the shorter and stockier Sean Brady. And it's actually worth noting that Michael Morales has a pretty extensive judo background in his upbringing in mixed martial arts, so could that even play a factor? Does he try and sprinkle in a cheeky takedown over Sean Brady just to prove that he has some weapons in his back pocket that Brady wouldn't necessarily look into leading into this fight and his game plan? These two are a combined 36-1 professionally. Both have ultra dangerous skill sets, but in complete opposite skill sets, at least what they've showed so far in the UFC. And I think that leads us to a very impactful and high stakes bout at 170 pounds, considering it's the same night that their title in their weight class will be getting defended. And we might as well pair this directly with the next #1 contender fight at welterweight, because it's very possible that out of these 4 fighters, the person with the most decisive and convincing victory may just be able to crack into that #1 contendership spot, and that is Leon Edwards versus the fighting nerd Carlos Prates. Between May of 2016 and December of 2023, Leon Edwards found himself on a 13-fight unbeaten streak, including a title-earning victory with the headshot heard around the world. Followed that up with a trilogy bout with Kamaru Usman, beating him by decision that time in pretty convincing fashion, may I add, and then even defended the title against Colby Covington, the former interim champion. Not to mention that long unbeaten streak also featured victories over Vicente Luque, Donald Cerrone, Gunnar Nelson, Rafael dos Anjos, and Nate Diaz. But all of that momentum, all of those victories stacked up in a row seem so far away at this point, because now Leon Rocky Edwards, the former champ, will enter UFC 322 on a 2-fight losing streak. And if he loses here, I think any potential future opportunities of challenging for a title are gone for good. We saw Leon Edwards have his rematch with Belal Muhammad at UFC 304 last summer, where Belal would utterly dominate the champion Leon Edwards en route to getting the 25-minute unanimous decision and becoming the new champion of the world. And then we already talked about Sean Brady's dominant win over Leon that came in his home country of England back in March. So not only is it 2 losses in a row, but it's 2 very demoralizing losses if you ask me. And you can now make the argument from a stylistic perspective, that is, that Leon Edwards is actually facing the most dangerous opponent of his entire career to date, and that is none other than the nightmare Carlos Prates. Because Prates enters this fight with 22 victories, and 20 of those have come by way of stoppage, with 17 of the 20 by way of knockout, including every single win in the UFC so far for him. And this is actually the first time that Leon Edwards has had to prepare and game plan and have a training camp for a striker since since June of 2021 when he fought Nate Diaz. So that is 5 consecutive training camps, all 5-round training camps, mind you, against grappling style heavy fighters, Kamaru Usman twice, Colby Covington, Belal Muhammad, and Sean Brady. So it's going to be interesting to see how Leon Edwards even approaches this fight because we haven't had to see him face someone like Prates in years. And obviously I'm not directly comparing Nate Diaz's skill set on the feet to Prates's, but you get the point. And after Carlos's 2023 Dana White Contender Series knockout contract earning performance, he has gone 5-1 in the UFC, and again, all 5 of those victories are by way of knockout, and the only loss for him was against Ian Machado Gary, and that was a short notice main event fight that he had back in April in Kansas City, where he would ultimately lose a decision to Gary, but that didn't come without some drama in the 5th and final round as Prates nearly put Ian Gary's lights out. And it's not as though Carlos Prates is just knocking out some guys you've never heard of. He has knockout victories over the Leech, Li Jingliang, Neil Magny, the all-time welterweight win leader, and most recently back at UFC 319 in August, he would land arguably the knockout of the year, and that came via spinning back elbow against Jeff Neal. And as a matter of fact, if you peel back the curtain even further and you take a look at Prates' career dating back to 2019, he has only lost one other time outside of that Gary fight, and that was in one championship back in June of 2019 via decision, meaning that over the last 6 years, he has won 12 out of his last 13 fights. And only one of those 12 victories was by way of decision, and that was all the way back in December of 2019. This man is lethal. And he is right now in his prime years at 32 years of age. I am extremely fascinated by this stylistic clash. What is going to happen when these two meet in the center of that octagon? Because it will be a 15-minute or less kickboxing affair, undoubtedly. And honestly, I'm not even going to be surprised if Leon Edwards even tries to implement a little bit of offensive wrestling in his own right here to maybe play it safe and ensure a safer path to victory. Because after all, that is where we saw Carlos Prates be exposed the most in his lone UFC loss to Ian Gary, where he would be taken down 4 separate times. And similarly to Leon Edwards, Ian Gary is a striker at the end of the day, but he has evolved his offensive grappling skill set over the past few years. So will Leon Edwards take a page out of Ian Gary's book? Will he have studied that tape between him and Prates and look to utilize his own grappling here against Prates? That is one of the bigger questions I have in terms of the X's and O's of this fight, to be honest. Because I really do feel like that on the feet, at this point in both of their respective careers, I have to lean on the side of Carlos Prates, and that's not even me saying that he's going to go in there and knock out Leon Edwards, because he has been outstruck by Kamaru Usman on the feet prior to the head kick heard around the world a few years ago. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for Leon Edwards to be outstruck here against Carlos Prates, someone that is known for his striking. And I'm telling you right now, if Carlos Prates comes in here and beats Leon Edwards, if he comes in here and knocks out Leon Edwards, and he's a part of the Fighting Nerds camp that everyone in the MMA community loves, including the UFC brass, he could absolutely be in the driver's seat for a #1 contendership bout. We are literally having a welterweight Grand Prix happening on this UFC 322 fight card. Not to mention, last week we saw Gabriel Bonfim crack into the top 10 by knocking out Randy Brown, and next week at UFC Qatar, we have Belal Muhammad facing Ian Machado Gary in the co-main event. So be sure to give me your predictions for these two big welterweight clashes at UFC 322 down in the comments below. Will it be Sean Brady or will it be Michael Morales remaining undefeated? And in this one, will it be the former champ Leon Edwards halting his losing streak and getting back into the W column? Or will it be Carlos Prates extending the hype and momentum of the Fighting Nerds that did take a little bit of a step back in 2025 so he can right the ship for them heading into 2026 if he gets a victory over Rocky Edwards? And lastly, for the main card, not for the entire preview, we have Beneil Dariush versus Benoit Saint Denis opening up the pay-per-view. Are you kidding me? Beneil Dariush currently sits at number 9 in the lightweight rankings, with Benoit Saint Denis a few spots behind him at number 13, and this is going to be a big-time prove-it moment for both of these fighters. For Beneil Dariush, he enters having lost 2 of his last 3 bouts. However, those losses were to Charles Oliveira, former champion, and Arman Tsarukyan, former almost title challenger before pulling out the day before. However, both of those weren't just losses, but they were first-round knockout losses, and even in the victory that Beneil Dariush is entering UFC 322 off of against Renato Moicano, where he would win a decision back in June, it did not come with ease, as Renato Moicano nearly got him out of there in the very first round as well. And it's sad that at now 36 years old, Beneil Dariush is possibly at the point in his career where he could never challenge for a title, even though between November of 2018 and October of 2022, this damn guy was on an 8-fight win streak and seemed to be all but certain to be a number one contender, not one, but 2 or 3 times during that streak. But it would never come to fruition, him challenging for a title, that is, as he would always have to take at least one more to earn that shot. And after essentially winning 2 of those, Tony Ferguson and Mateusz Gamrot, he would have to do it a 3rd time, and that was when he would be halted by Charles Oliveira, the former champion. And after Benoit Saint Denis would lose his UFC debut back in October of 2021, this man picked up an insane amount of steam, racking up 5 consecutive victories, all 5 of them by way of stoppage between June of 2022 and November of 2023. So not only was he winning, not only was he finishing fights, but he was staying very active. But it was the infamous night of March 9th, 2024 at UFC 299, one of the biggest cards of that year, where Benoit Saint Denis would get an absolutely massive step up in competition as he would take on Dustin the Diamond Poirier, the former, at that time, 2-time undisputed title challenger and former interim champion. And after having an incredibly successful round 1 where it looked as though Benoit Saint Denis was going to win his 6th consecutive fight, Dustin Poirier would bounce back in round 2 and send Benoit to the Shadow Realm with a vicious knockout. But I wouldn't say that that loss necessarily sent Benoit back too far, because that was just an insane jump up in general. I believe he was ranked number 12 at that time, taking on the number 2 ranked Poirier. But it was the fight after the Poirier loss where MMA fans started to have concern for Benoit's future career, because not only would he lose a 2nd consecutive bout, but he would be absolutely decimated by Renato Moicano before being finished at the end of round 2 due to a doctor stoppage because of the insane amount of damage that he succumbed to. However, things are trending upward for Benoit now, as he will enter UFC 322 on a 2-fight win streak, and both of them, of course, by way of stoppage, because at the end of the day, this man does have a 100% finish rate. It would come against short notice opponent Kyle Prepolek back in May at UFC 315, where he would submit him in the 2nd round, and then in September he would take on Mauricio Rufy, another teammate of the Fighting Nerds camp, and he would absolutely expose the weaknesses and holes in his game, taking him down at will, holding him there, landing big time ground and pound strikes, threatening with submissions, and then ultimately land the submission victory in the 2nd round via face crank. And now everyone is right back on that Benoit Saint Denis bandwagon, and I think it's rightfully earned by him, especially when you consider that he has such finishing upside against someone in Beneil Dariush who is no stranger to being stopped. And when you consider that BSD is going to be 7 years younger at just 29 years of age, just now getting ready to enter his prime, I have to agree with the betting odds here of him being the heavy favorite, and I do believe that he will get the victory in this fight. But it's not necessarily a given, because Beneil Dariush does have some very good, underrated, dare I say, offensive wrestling and grappling. But is that going to be enough to get a victory over someone as dangerous as Benoit Saint Denis, who does at the end of the day have 7 more submission wins than he does knockouts, 11-4? I think it's a very uphill battle for the veteran in Dariush, and it's a must-win fight for him, because if he goes on a stretch of losing 3 out of his last 4, any small ounce that he already has of title contention can be kissed goodbye. For Benoit Saint Denis, he can enter the lightweight top 10 for the very first time, and it comes at a pivotal point in time for 155 pounds as we head into 2026 with a new champion and no clear-cut number 1 contender yet. But the party doesn't stop there, because now we have to head to the absolutely loaded preliminary card, and that is capped off with the headlining spot between Bo Nickel and Rodolfo Vieira. Bo Nickel entering this fight off the heels of his first professional mixed martial arts loss, where not only would he lose, but he would be finished by Renier de Ritter via 2nd round TKO back in May in Des Moines, Iowa. And this was obviously a very eye-opening performance for the mixed martial arts community, because up to that point, Bo Nickel had literally been perfect, and even in his lackluster performance and victory over Paul Craig, he still was able to get the victory and show some evolved skill sets in the stand-up realm. But in that fight with RDR, he was unable to get anything going. Not only was he not able to utilize his insane wrestling skills, but he also wasn't able to have any success on the feet either, as he would be finished in very impressive and brutal fashion by Renier de Ritter. And of course, that loss for Bo Nickel had all of the haters coming out of the woodwork to shit on him and talk trash, essentially saying that he is a wrestler that will never amount to anything in the actual sport of mixed martial arts, at least when he faces the best of the best in terms of competition. So you've got to imagine that entering UFC 322, there is a massive chip on the shoulder of Bo Nickel as he wants to shut up all of the doubters, all of the haters, and get back into the win column, something that he is absolutely used to throughout his professional mixed martial arts and wrestling amateur career. At just 29 years of age, he is still just about to enter those prime years, and obviously he still has leaps and bounds to grow in terms of an all-around mixed martial arts skill set, especially if he wants to be a title contender in the future like he says that he plans to be. And we can't ignore the finishing prowess that he has entering this fight, having finished 6 of his 7 bouts with 4 submissions and 2 knockouts, the only decision coming in that fight against Paul Craig, and he is taking on someone in Rodolfo Vieira who, yes, is an absolutely lethal jiu-jitsu practitioner, but outside of that, I don't see much of a threat here for Bo Nickel, if I'm being honest. Rodolfo Vieira is 36 years of age, so will be 7 years older than Bo entering this fight, and in his 6-year UFC career has a record of 6-3. Now, to be fair, those 3 losses are to very good competition: Anthony Hernandez, Chris Curtis, and Andre Petroski. However, he doesn't necessarily have that impactful, impressive victory in terms of a resume and name value standpoint, if you ask me. However, we can't ignore the fact that 5 of Rodolfo's 6 UFC victories have come by way of submission, and the only one that didn't was his most recent fight back in August where he got a decision win over Trayshawn Gore. And all in all, has finished 10 of his 11 victories with 9 of those 10 by way of submission. Obviously, someone as accredited as him in the jiu-jitsu realm will have a resume like this. But is that going to work against someone as good as an offensive wrestler as Bo Nickel? And to be quite frank with you, Bo Nickel may just not even attempt a single takedown in this fight to avoid the biggest threat for him in this one. And if the fight does stay standing, I'm not by any means saying that Bo Nickel can strike with the Israel Adesanyas of the world, but he is going to be a more polished, cleaner striker than Rodolfo Vieira, and I think for that reason alone, I have to lean Nickel in this fight. But I could very well see it playing out similarly to how Paul Craig's fight with Bo Nickel went. Relatively lackluster, leaving MMA fans clamoring for more and having even more reason to continue talking trash about the former Penn State wrestler. And from one middleweight clash that I project to be relatively lackluster to a middleweight clash that is absolutely going to be a barn burner, we discuss Roman Kopylov versus Gregory Rodriguez, both fighting for their opportunity to reinsert themselves into the middleweight top 15. Both of these fighters are 33 years of age, right in their prime, and are finishers to their core. RoboCop has finished 14 of his 17 victories with 11 knockouts and 3 submissions, and Kopylov has finished 12 out of 14, all 12 finishes by way of knockout. Not to mention, Kopylov has been finished in 2 of his 4 losses, and Gregory Rodriguez has been knocked out in 4 of his 6 losses. This one is going to deliver. Gregory Rodriguez will enter this fight having won 4 of his last 5 bouts, with the only loss coming to former title challenger Jared Cannonier, and that was in RoboCop's first ever UFC main event opportunity, where he would have some pretty good moments in that 4-round bout. But at the end of the day, it just proved to be too much too soon for RoboCop, as Jared Cannonier would continue to get the upper hand on him as the fight would progress, ultimately leading to the 4th round knockout just 21 seconds into the championship rounds. But he has already bounced back from that loss back in February with a knockout over Jack Hermanson in the very first round back in June. And for Roman Kopylov, he has won 6 of his last 8 bouts. However, unlike RoboCop, he enters this fight off of a loss, and that was a decision to Paulo Costa back at UFC 318 in July. However, the only other loss for Kopylov over the last 3 years was to Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, and outside of that, it has been all victories, with 5 of those 6 by way of knockout, and most of those 5 pretty vicious. This will be a kickboxing back and forth bloody war where the winner is going to have to go through the fire and pull it out to get this victory, and I think that whoever that is going to do it in very decisive fashion. Don't blink for this one. This is the prelim most guaranteed to deliver fireworks. And we've already talked about 2 potential number 1 contender fights, so we might as well talk about a third, and this one is in the flyweight division between Erin Blanchfield and Tracy Cortez, number 4 and number 8 respectively, battling it out on the very same night that the title in their weight class is being defended between Valentina Shevchenko and Zhang Weili in the super fight co-main event. And it's also fitting that much like Michael Morales, Erin Blanchfield is also 26 years of age, but already has a plethora of high-level mixed martial arts experience, and while she isn't 18-0 like Morales, she does have a very positive record of 13-2, and one of those 2 losses is to Tracy Cortez. And that fight came way back in February of 2019 when Erin Blanchfield was just 19 years old and couldn't even have a legal drink of beer yet. And since that very close split decision loss to Cortez in 2019, Erin Blanchfield has won 10 of her last 11 fights. And a lot of those wins, specifically in the UFC, have come against very high-level competition, featuring Miranda Maverick, a top 15 flyweight, Jessica Andrade, a former strawweight champion, a former bantamweight contender, and a former flyweight title challenger, Talia Santos, a former flyweight title challenger, and debatably should have been a former flyweight champion, and most recently in November of last year, Rose Namajunas, the former 2-time strawweight champion, and the only loss in the UFC was to Manon Fiorot, who after that bout would go on to face Valentina Shevchenko at UFC 315 in May for the title. Being that Erin is only 26 years old, I do feel that it is still highly likely that she could be a champion before it's all said and done, and she's made it pretty clear throughout her progressive history in the UFC that she is continuing to polish up her game, but that fight against Manon Fiorot was a very one-sided fight because Erin wasn't able to utilize her grappling and would be heavily outmatched in the striking realm. But luckily for her, that isn't what Tracy Cortez poses, as Tracy Cortez, much like Erin Blanchfield, is known for her wrestling. The 31-year-old Cortez is 12-2 overall, so these two combined for a 25-4 record professionally, and will enter this fight coming off of a victory against Viviane Araújo back in June where she would earn a decision, and that was a much-needed bounce back for Tracy Cortez, as prior to that she would have a short-notice main event opportunity against Rose Namajunas last summer where she would lose over the course of 5 rounds. All in all, Tracy Cortez is 6-1 in the UFC and holds victories over Melissa Gatto and Jasmine Jasdavicius, not to mention the aforementioned Viviane Araújo win. But I do just feel like 6 years later from their first fight, it is Erin Blanchfield that in my opinion has the higher ceiling and has the more potential. And that's not to say that Tracy Cortez can't come in here and improve to 2-0 against Erin Blanchfield in what would be hands down the biggest victory of her UFC career, but I just feel like for both of them, when you compare their UFC specific runs, it is Erin Blanchfield who has fought the much higher level of competition and gotten the much bigger victories. But it's interesting, right? Because both of them are known for their offensive wrestling, so how is that going to go when they face one another here in the UFC? Will it be Erin Blanchfield that has the better offensive wrestling and gets Tracy Cortez on her back, or will it be Tracy Cortez who gets Erin Blanchfield on her back? Because when you look back at their UFC careers, they haven't really had to face anyone like each other. They instead have been facing people that want to keep the fight standing rather than getting taken down by both of them. But now when they both enter here wanting to take down one another, someone's wrestling is going to have the upper hand over the others. And if I had to bet on it right now, I would lean on the side of Erin Blanchfield, but I'm very curious to hear what your predictions are for this bout down below and what you think the stakes could be, considering that the title is being defended on the very same night that this fight takes place. And there is one more ranked matchup happening on this card, and it's early on in the night of the prelims, and that is the longtime veteran and 40 years young Angela Hill putting up her top 15 spot against teammate of Erin Blanchfield, Fatima Klein, who will be entering this one on the heels of one of the most vicious knockouts in strawweight history. And that came back in July as Fatima Klein would get a head kick knockout over Melissa Martinez, and prior to that in January would have a second round TKO via elbows on the ground. All in all, the 25-year-old Klein is 8-1, having finished 5 of those 8 with 4 knockouts and 1 submission, and the only loss was her UFC debut that came on short notice and up a weight class at 125, and it wasn't just against any flyweight, it was against Jasmine Jasdavicius in the midst of her big win streak that she was on. So now Klein is looking to extend her win streak to 3 and insert herself into the top 15 of the strawweight division, and I think it's safe to say that she is the hottest prospect going in this weight class right now. But it's not going to come easy because, quite frankly, no fight comes easy when you're taking on Angela Overkill Hill. And while yes, Hill does enter this fight coming off of a loss to Yasmin Lucindo back in August, she also has a victory in 2025, and it was a decision over Ketlin Souza, who is a prospect at 115, similar to Fatima Klein. And to be quite honest with you, those are the types of fights that Angela Hill tends to win, because if you peel back the curtain a little bit further, she also has victories over Luana Pinheiro, who at that point was a prospect, and Denise Gomes, who is now sitting at number 13 in the division, but at that point would have only been, I believe, 22 or 23 years old and labeled as a young prospect. Then if you look even further down the rabbit hole, in 2022, she had victories over Emily Ducote, who at that point was a young rising prospect, and Lupi Godinez, who now is, yes, ranked number 6 in the division, but 3 years ago was, you guessed it, a young rising prospect. Typically, the losses that we see Angela Hill have are to other veterans or top 15 ranked fighters such as Tisha Pennington, Amanda Lemos, Virna Jandiroba, and Mackenzie Dern, who now just so happens to be the damn champion. And Fatima Klein, much like her teammate Erin Blanchfield, loves to get the fight down to the canvas and utilize ground and pound and submission threats to lead her way to victory, but is she going to be able to do that against someone like Angela Hill, who has done it all and seen it all in this fight game? And if she can, you absolutely have to have your eyes on Klein heading into 2026, as she will be ranked in the top 15, and assuming she has another 3-fight year in 2026 like she had in 2025, this woman could be in title contention by this time next year. So that is it for the UFC 322 breakdown, and goodness gracious, is it safe to say that this is the best card of the year? I think so. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, because we are on the road to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and the goal is to hit that milestone before the end of the year, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. On top of weekly breakdowns of the biggest and best fights and storylines, I also recap the most meaningful results, and I give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. You can also join the discussion on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Monday and Friday podcast episodes release there. Have a great weekend, enjoy this absolutely stacked fight card, and I will see you all for the recap.